Alright, so I've gotten a lot of questions about my GT6 Project Bronson, and I wanted to just kind of do a quick video just so everyone can kind of get an idea what the procedure here was. So I race autocross and decided that the car I wanted to build was a Triumph GT6. In this case, I was able to find a GT6 MK1 and was able to start working on it. Shortly after driving the car, I decided that the straight six that was in it was not going to facilitate what I wanted to do as well as something else. So I'd already kind of decided I wanted to do a Miata engine, so I ended up purchasing a 1999 Miata NB for a really good price, and ended up cannibalizing the car. So I ended up using the engine, transmission, and all of the wiring and ECU. So as of right now, it's the Miata transmission mated to the Triumph GT6 rear diff. That is not going to be permanent. It's either going to break, or the fact that I can't drift the car is going to become an issue for me. So later on, I do plan on probably going turbo with the car, so it'll probably break at that junction. Now, just a little bit of back history there is the Miata engines are very affordable here in California and easy to get your hands on. So potentially while racing the car, if it were to break, it wouldn't cost me a fortune to get another motor in the car. So that was one motivating factor. This engine stock makes 140 horsepower, which is difficult to achieve without a lot of modification to the stock engine in the GT6. So that also made a lot of sense to kind of push the decision. I ended up cutting 200 pounds out of the front end between the Miata engine and the engine tranny for the GT6. It was weighed because it ended up being shipped to somebody that was interested in purchasing the engine. So we know that we've cut 200 pounds out of the front, so that right there is a good savings over the Miata initially. And the Miatas, as well as taking a beating really well, they're pretty prominent in the drift scene, and in autocross culture they're really common. This is an engine that takes a flogging well. So they wrap 8,000 RPM, they rev limiter at about 7, and they'll just take that all day. So that was part of the motivation, and they do take turbo really well. So it's not uncommon that on stock internals you can make about 250 horsepower on a Miata engine without blowing it to pieces. So I'm hoping for maybe at some point a safe tune 200 horsepower in this car, maybe 250, but that is way down the line. I was really just trying to get the car running on this power plant so I can enjoy it for a little while, enjoy having a really good gas mileage, reliable, good looking classic car. So for now, we're just gonna leave it be. I'm happy to have it the way it is, but there are plans for later, so just something to keep in mind. Feel free to ask any questions. I'll be glad to help in any way I can. I'm not trying to push everyone to do this. I realize purists aren't going to be a real big fan of it because it is taking away a lot from the refined British culture of the car. But with that in mind, I knew I was doing it. I didn't care. So this was a build for me. So if you're interested, go ahead and hit me up. I can help in any way I can. I am not a Miata specialist. There are a lot of guys in the Miata community that would probably be glad to help you. But having done it already with a GT6, I might be able to help in some way. So feel free to ask any questions. Here it is. I'm just going to kind of go in a circle around the engine bay to try and describe what I ended up doing. So obviously there were some cosmetic things and there were some things that were more utilitarian. So I ended up making a rod and some stoppers for the clutch master cylinder. This is a Miata master cylinder. The one for the Triumph, even if you put an adapter on it, just doesn't have enough fluid moving through it, so you can't use it. I tried. The harness has been thinned down quite a bit, but it does still keep a lot of the harness from the Miata. including the factory OBD2 style diagnostic box. Now that's not the diagnostic scanner, that's just the diagnostics box. So you can actually direct pin test some of those systems. Largely that doesn't make a lot of purpose here because most of those systems aren't actually hooked up in this car, like ABS and airbags and things of that nature. So for exhaust purposes, I plumbed one of my O2 sensors up top and one actually down below where it crosses off into my two lakeside pipes. I ended up using a turbo header for dual purpose. I plan on probably doing turbo later with this car, and it made it so the exhaust was relatively centered because it does come down and have a bit of a difficult time clearing. So down here it barely has enough room in front of the motor mount, and it doesn't really have enough room unless you get really complicated with your bends to go behind the motor mount. And we'll look at that motor mount situation a little more in a minute. But to get analog gauges here, I just ran an inline for a standard type analog gauge. So nothing too fantastical there. For the radiator, there's a stock Mazda radiator, and all we did is we raked it so that it cleared the front of the engine and it did clear the hood. And it does sit pretty close, and you can see that we've had to modify the inner fenders a little bit, but not much. So it actually sits with a pretty good amount of room here. Go ahead and move to the other side. Now on this side, I went ahead and made this little rail right here, just so I had somewhere to mount the accessories that would normally sit on the inner fender of the Miata. Now we don't have that inner fender ability, so I just made this rail so I had something to mount to kind of put it in the orientation it would be in on the Miata. Let's see what else we got here. So as for the motor mount itself, in the Miata there's a sandwich plate on the motor mount that's supposed to sit between the motor mount and the chassis. So all I did was I took that, inverted it, cut it, and welded it to the chassis. So that's not too bad, and I'm still able to use rubberized mounts. It's pretty straightforward. I still have the emissions system all here, so I have a charcoal canister and all that. I am still running the stock engine fuse block. I don't have windshield wipers on this car. I probably never will. It rains in California like 4 times a year, and I just won't drive it that day. So I was able to go ahead and use this space for that. For the actual engine wiring itself, this is my chassis box. Now, the wiring on this car was a little rough when I got it, so I have the engine itself separated from my chassis. So if something goes wrong with the motor, I can look there. If it goes wrong with, say, lights, blinkers, anything of that nature, I know to look on my chassis fuse block. So not a whole lot to it there. It's just a battery top for a battery box. And then I've got the ECU here. And this is pretty much the rest of the wiring harness that was not going to be easily cut down, because it does actually all end up going somewhere. So, for example, I still have the fuse block, but you'll notice that almost all of the fuses have been removed. They're just not necessary on this car. I do have a ground strap. I actually have a Bluetooth OBD2 scanner on the car right now, so I do get live data on that. This would normally be where the gauges and the gauge cluster come together for the Miata cluster. Now, for my purposes, because I'm not running most of those things, I've used mechanical gauges on a lot of that. The only two that I had to tap into were these two guys here, and that's going to be my tach sensor and fuel sender wire. So there's not a whole lot to it there. So you can see I ended up having to take a relatively fair amount out of the trans tunnel here. So the total amount equates to about 9 inches total. So if you're trying to maintain the stock position of your emergency brake or parking brake, you end up getting pretty close to it. I resolved that by just building a shifter that would get it out of the way, and then creating a cover plate for where the original shifter location was. So I still have to make a cover to make this aesthetically pleasing, but it works for now. Because I ended up utilizing the Miata gas tank, I decided the best way to go, it is a little bit taller, it's about 4 inches taller than the one for the GT6. I ended up making a cover tray here and was able to use the pocket originally designed for the fuel tank, but centering the tank, and then the evap systems for the Mazda engine under this side and the battery and filler neck are on this side. I would have liked to use this filler neck, but this system is actually pressurized at the tank, so it does know if you have a bad gas cap, or it plays into the emissions factor on these cars. So I ended up having to use the original fuel neck for the sake of trying to get this to seal properly. So this is my tank cover. So we're just going to do a quick in-car startup.